Shalom and welcome to a TV7 Israel Jerusalem studio special. As we're about to embark on a shorter summer broadcast break, it seems like a good time to look around, obviously with Jerusalem as the center of our universe, for some regional stocktaking. Midway through 2021, with new leaders elected in relevant capitals such as Washington, Tehran and Jerusalem, as well as amid looming prospects of the revival of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, which seemingly in tandem escalates tensions on the ground in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon and Yemen, among other relevant sectors of interest. Joining me for this comprehensive regional overview with focus on direct and indirect implications for Israel is Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the co-host of TV7's Middle East Review, vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and a lecturer at Shalem College in Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us, Eran.
Always.
I'd like also to welcome Ambassador Ayalon, who is also a co-host of TV7 Middle East Review, lecturer at the New York University, who formerly served as Israel's ambassador to the United States, as well as Jerusalem's deputy foreign minister. Thank you for joining us as well. And, of course, Mr. Amir Oren, TV7's analyst and host of Watchmen Talk. And I'd like to start with the first topic. We will make some kind of round table, even though this table is not necessarily round, but we will try and focus on each country and then slowly expand from Israel in the center and then go to Lebanon, Syria, so on and so forth, Iran, of course, and also on a global scale. But let's start with Israel. Dr. Eran, let's start with you. What is the key issue Israel is currently challenged with and focused on?
Well, of course, there's a new government in Israel, which is an experiment. It's the first time, I think, we've seen a coalition that is, on one hand, challenged very severely from the outside by still leadership of the former Prime Minister Netanyahu, but at the same time, it extends from the hard right to the deep left, with an Islamist Arab party brought into the equation. It is a unique challenge in our political history. And of course, one of the obvious aspects of this experiment is that they're going to need to avoid deeply controversial issues. That's not easy to do. Already there are some questions arising over the laws of migration, the question of whether or not Palestinians who are married to Israelis can be given citizenship, other divisive issues. And this is going to be a prolonged test of the capacity of such a unique coalition to hold together. But this is internally the most important challenge. I think they will, of course, enjoy the benefits of the emergence of Israel from the Corona era. There's a hiccup in some rising numbers, but not enough to basically break the rise of the economy. And I think they will benefit from a dramatic rise of the economy in 2021, 2022. If they pass a budget successfully, they will survive their first year, for sure, maybe the first 2 years. Beyond that, it's anybody's guess.
Ambassador Ayalon.
Yes, well, Jonathan, you said a round table, but they are round corners. So I will try to be kind to both this government and the former one. There is a host of issues for this government to deal with, and now we see more and more how the former government was quite careless, I don't want to say negligent, about not dealing, thoroughly with issues, starting with Iran. The order, the instruction of the Prime Minister Netanyahu for all the professional echelons, Mossad, IDF, anyone, not to converse or not to engage with the Americans on a detailed manner hurt Israel. We see the results. The results is that today Iran is closer to the bomb than before. The engagement in Washington, in the Congress, was probably a wrong idea because it didn't stop the JCPOA on the one hand, and it brought a real friction between Israel and the Democrats, between Israel and reform and democratic Jews, not to the benefit of the total issue of stopping Iran. Secondly, we saw in Gaza, there is not any kind of permanent solution to Gaza, but to do the same thing over and over and over again, not only is futile, but I think it was dangerous. And unless and until you deal with Gaza in a comprehensive strategic way, which has not been done by the former government, some would say that it was Bibi's actually grand strategy to divide and separate Gaza from the West Bank. So he was actually helping Hamas vis-a-vis Abu Mazen in Ramallah. But this is just a tactical issue that goes from one campaign to another campaign to the detriment of everyone. And the last thing is the Palestinian issue at large. And here also, nothing has been done. Nobody is preparing or prepared for what will come after the Abu Mazen era. Is it going to be an all-out war over there? Dahlan is waiting in the wing in Qatar to come in. And here there has not been, there has not been any preparation for it. So this is a major challenge also for this government to deal with.
Indeed, we hear domestic issue, international issues. Emil, from both angles, how can we look at the situation and say, is this government actually going to survive? As Dr. Lerman has also stated, without a budget, if it's not passed, this government is going to fall regardless. But let's say it does pass. Is there continuity on the security level with regard to the security of the State of Israel, and also on the social level? To what degree is the State of Israel currently, the people of Israel, to what degree are they resilient in the face of those various challenges at hand?
In the current system of government, and I say current because it has been changed, at least on the margins, over the last 2 years in order to accommodate this new device of a prime minister along with an alternate prime minister. But in the current system of government, it is quite difficult to topple the incumbents because one must present an alternative list of ministers, not just in a vote of no confidence make the government fall short. And the very reason Netanyahu could not come up with a government, even though he was given the right of first refusal, is still there. Should Netanyahu leave the scene, yes, the government could change. Likud could join or even lead a new government. But as long as Netanyahu is there, nothing really changed. Now, when the State of Israel was established, we had a similar problem to what we all described here of various poles being in the government, but it was on another issue altogether, synagogue and state. And the way founding Prime Minister Ben-Gurion solved it was with the magic formula of the status quo. He and his left-leaning Labour Party did not get their way of giving the secular majority in Israel what it wanted, and neither did the religious parties. They could not impose on Israel their way of life, even though Israel, in 1947, before it was established, pledged to pass a constitution. It couldn't because of the religious parties. So this hallowed concept of the status quo will also hold for what we talked about vis-a-vis the Palestinians. However, the first issue of synagogue and state was only internal, in addition perhaps to the diaspora, especially American Jews. But it was essentially an internal issue, a domestic issue. The other issue is subject to external initiatives. Should President Biden and other world powers come up with an initiative, the response expected of the Israeli government could tear it apart. And this is one reason why they would not do it in Washington and Brussels and other places until and unless they were sure that the government could respond without giving way again to Netanyahu and Likud.
Indeed. However, the status quo cannot withstand the pragmatic developments that are happening on the ground. And therefore, I'd like to keep on this track, which we're currently on. The Palestinians, there was, of course, the conflict last month between Israel and the Islamist organizations in the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. There was a tactical achievement there, also on the strategic level, but a tactical achievement there if we look on a regional aspect of things. And then we have, of course, Egypt. Egypt's playing a key role in everything that has to do with achieving a cessation of hostilities, of course, continuing with dialogue on both sides, Israel, the Palestinians in Gaza, as well as the international community, receiving this great role of center stage, if you will, on regional stability, which shifted the opinion, probably, at least vocally so, in Washington with regard to President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and his government. Dr. Lerman, give us a first understanding. To what degree is Egypt crucial to the current standing and the implications for Israel?
The Egyptians this time moved in early on, before the end of the fighting, to say that they will also undertake aspects of the reconstruction. It's probably not going to be Egyptian money, given Egypt's...
Despite the pledge of $500 million dollars?
$500 million will probably not be ultimately defrayed from the Egyptian budget. They will come from somewhere. And we all know who sponsors Sisi's regional role. It is absolutely crucial in the eyes of our friends in the Gulf, namely the Emirates, for Egypt, rather than other forces in the region, to take the lead. In this context also, I see the growing Egyptian-Jordanian involvement in Iraq, trying to stabilize an alternative to Iranian hegemony in Baghdad. This is also a very positive development. Now, Israel and Egypt are in the same harness in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are as close as they have ever been since '79 in strategic terms. We share the same goals. We look at the region the same way. We have the same rivals. I wouldn't say enemies. Turkey is not an enemy, but it is an aspiring hegemon, which we refuse to accommodate.
And also supports the Islamists, the Iran and also Hamas.
And they do this through their sponsorship of the Brotherhood, essentially, and the Brotherhood is Egypt's enemy. Now, Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. In a certain way, so is one of the parties in the coalition. But against this background, the conversation, long, extensive, and well-publicized on both sides, both in Egypt and in Israel, between new Prime Minister Bennett and Sisi, after pretty much a breakthrough, because I think Netanyahu had very limited dialogue with Sisi recently. It's an indication that Israel is moving in tandem with the Egyptians on the key regional issues. That's a very useful development. Hamas cannot ignore the Egyptians. They have to listen. They have no choice. Turkey's role has been greatly diminished as a result. I think that in strategic terms, Hamas was defeated regionally during the fighting in May. They may have had an impact on Israeli society, an Israeli Arab society, but regionally, not a single Arab country of those who have diplomatic representatives in Israel even called their ambassador or chargé d'affaires back home for consultations, which is the minimal expression of displeasure.
Indeed. Well, I think one of the quite intriguing things about the last part that you stated was that Hamas, in its victory statement by Ismail Haniyeh from Doha in Qatar, he thanked Iran for its political support, for its technical support, for its logistical support, Qatar for, of course, hosting him himself, but also for supporting on financial aspects as well as other aspects. And then he went on and on, but there was one country he did not mention, and that was the most vocal country during the entire ordeal, which was Turkey. He did not thank Turkey, he did not thank President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and from what I hear from Ankara, this came after there was a disagreement between the two sides, also especially from the Turkish side, not willing to convey or at least provide Hamas with military means, which is a red line even for Turkey at this stage because of the implications thereof. But I'd like to stay with Egypt shortly, and there is, of course, the summit that was in Baghdad this time between King Abdullah II, Prime Minister al-Kadhimi of Iraq, and President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. They discussed various angles between the three, and of course cooperation and on civic levels, but also on coordinating approaches towards different conflicts. One of those conflicts being also Libya, that Egypt has a significant interest in, and Israel is closely also watching for various reasons, specifically the Eastern Mediterranean being quite strategically important. But to what degree is Egypt now improving Israel's standing with the Arab world, with Saudi Arabia, which was reluctant of normalizing relations with it? How do you see that, Ambassador Ayalon?
Well, I think Egypt is the major winner from the geopolitics and the strategic developments in this era and this time specifically, catapulting itself again, not just by name, but in reality as the leader of the Arab world. Sisi is making himself and Egypt very useful for the American interests, with the American withdrawing now from the Middle East. So the reliance on Egyptian diplomatic ability is very, very important. And this is why the summit in Iraq was very, very instrumental, I would say, for all the allies in the region. Basically, what I understand right now is that the region itself, maybe by default, not so much by design, but it's becoming also a design also from Washington, that with their withdrawal, they don't not want to leave a chaotic situation or a void. So this void of the absence of American presence here will be filled by two forces, diplomatically by Egypt and militarily by Israel. And that also puts Israel and Egypt in very, very good standing, having to coordinate all these issues together. The only ones that may see this with dismay or chagrin are Turkey and Iran.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to raise something that was not in the headlines that many seem to have missed. Egypt is seemingly also pivoting westward after years and years and years that it had collaborated with Russia in joint maneuvers, in the war in Libya, and in other aspects throughout the region, including an energy or nuclear reactor that Russia wants to build for Egypt. Now we see a glimpse of shift westward with an agreement between the Egyptian armed forces and the Texas Army of the United States Armed Forces, providing also different maneuvers between the two militaries, providing various angles. Is this to be taken significantly, or is this just a single signal from Cairo itself and the United States pulling it in?
No, it is very significant. And by way of a general observation, if one looks at Israel's strategic successes throughout its 73 years, obviously the Israeli Defense Forces has first priority. Also the strategic deterrent, which the entire world ascribes to Israel. But in addition to that, the alliance with the United States, and then the 40 or so years of peace with Egypt, these are the most significant pluses which Israel can say it has shored up strategically. Now, before the withdrawal from the entire peninsula of Sinai, many IDF generals cautioned against it because they said that to be on the safe side, Israel must hold on to at least some of the territory for fear that the regime in Cairo will not survive. At that time, it was Sadat. Even after Sadat was assassinated, President Mubarak did not abrogate the peace treaty. And the same goes for the Hashemites in Jordan. We have seen Hussein, who ascended to the throne when he was a teenager and who was believed to have a very short lifespan. Eventually, of course, he buried almost everyone, including, unfortunately, Prime Minister Rabin, who was assassinated while Hussein died of natural causes. And his son, Abdullah, as was mentioned here, has been in power for the last 22 years. Also, the Assad family in Damascus. The father, Hafez, goes, the son, Bashar, holds the throne. And as for Egypt, there was a glitch because of Barack Obama's opposition to the Mubarak regime and his support of the Islamists, especially then President Morsi. And when Sisi took over, not entirely democratically, the US administration came out against him and in a way is still called towards him because of human rights problems. But leaving that aside, obviously Egypt is Israel's best regional partner along with Jordan, and the Americans too see the wisdom of anchoring their policy on Egypt. And by the way, this is a return to the 1980s or so with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which of course was based on Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and 4 other Gulf countries, but also had Egypt as a de facto partner. So perhaps now that Saddam is gone in Iraq, that Iran is probably going to be blocked by a new deal, the JCPOA 2.0, we are probably going to a regional setup in which Israel will be a member in good standing alongside its peace partners, Egypt and Jordan.
Indeed. Well, knowing anything from history, everything can change from one day or another, and there is the magic word, miscalculation, that may disrupt plans of world leaders as well as regional leaders. But I'd like to continue to the next front. Of course, we covered now the western or southwestern border of Israel, which is the second longest border of the country, going now to the longest border of the country, and the immediate neighbor thereafter, Jordan. And of course, we spoke about the trilateral summit between the King of Jordan with the Prime Minister of Iraq and the President of Egypt. Jordan is becoming more of an active player, also with regard to the situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians, seeking to enlarge its role somewhat, but at the same time, it's dealing with many challenges domestic, many challenges to its north, and is not necessarily in good standing with most of its neighbors. Dr. Eran, give us a little bit of...
Well, Jordan is an absolutely vital building block in anyone trying to sustain stability in the region. It's not a powerful player, but it is a player that, if destabilized, could bring the whole region down. And the Iranians really have to destabilize Jordan. I'll keep going in my mind to the infamous tweet of the leader, Ali Khamenei, in November 14. He was sort of thinking over the implications of the previous round with Hamas, and his conclusion was, of course, that Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth as a political entity. There should be a referendum in which only the Jews who were living in the land of Israel before 1917 or something would be allowed to vote, and the rest would be sent in ships back home, or if they resist, well, Allah God help them. And to do this, he says, we need to arm the West Bank, the way we have armed Gaza, turned the West Bank into another Gaza. There's only one way of doing that, which is to destabilize Jordan, turn it once again into a base of operations as it was in the late 1960s until King Hussein put an end to it in September 70, and penetrate. This is also why they are sending their drones from their bases in Syria into Israel by way of Jordanian airspace. This is the core element of any Iranian strategy for the demise of Israel must include the destabilization of Jordan, or at least the freedom to use Jordan for Iranian purposes.
Could we define Jordan as Israel's depth of field or strategic depth of field for that matter?
Both. It cuts in both directions, because also the ability of the Jordanian regime to survive against all odds. I mean, Amir was referring to the famous note of Secretary of State Dulles, John Foster Dulles, who said, this young King Hussein is a nice chap, but he will not survive long, nor will his kingdom. Of course, he buried not only Dulles, but a few others afterwards.
Including Arafat.
Well, yes, he saw him go as well. So, Arafat died 5 years after him, but but he was finished politically by then. But King Hussein enjoyed the capacity to survive because he was part of Israel's strategic envelope. This is what happens in 1970. The Syrians invade, and Israel makes it very clear that Jordan is part of our defense concept. And this has remained the prospect for any coup leader or invader, Saddam Hussein or whoever, who may have contemplated the idea of taking over Jordan. They had to contend with the fact that the IDF was in a position to repulse such a takeover.
Just to visualize for our viewers, if one looks eastward from where we are sitting now in Jerusalem, one sees first the West Bank, then the Jordan River and the East Bank, which is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, then Iraq, and then Iran. So Iran has to step over or sidestep all of those in the middle in order to get here.
Indeed. Ambassador Ayalon, how do you view this on the Jordanian part? Of course, I don't think any of those countries would necessarily want to invade Jordan if they know that Israeli planes would hover over them and make sure they can't be victorious in such a reality. But also on a diplomatic level, the Jordanians are working very hard in order to withstand the various challenges and secure also European support, secure American support, as well as to a lesser degree Russian and Chinese support. How do you see that play into the Jordanian role in this region?
Is one just addition to what Amir said. This is true, that for the Iranians to come to penetrate and come to Israel's border, they have to go over these obstacles of Iraq and Jordan. This is why Syria is so important for them, because what they do is actually using this wing, this western wing, and they're trying to go from the Syrian and use the Syrian Jordanian border to make all their trouble. This is why Syria and the Syrian situation is so important for us and for the United States. And hopefully the United States will not just leave Syria. Right now they are actually the only protectors of the Kurds, but also in a way they are protecting against any ambitions of the Iranians to entrench also on our side of the border and Jordan.
They are leaving a residual force in Tanef,
right,
which is the southern part of Syria, the Jordanian border.
With the reason of protecting also the oil fields of the Kurds and all that. Yes, but anyway, about Jordan. Jordan is again very strategically. I think that there is a real feeling of relief in Amman, and especially in the palace. I would say almost a breath of fresh air when they see the new government here in Israel. It was just infamously coming out to the air about 2 months ago, I would say, quote-unquote coup, or the attempt coup against King Abdallah. And in this collusion, the ones who were implicated were Jared Kushner and Trump from Washington, and also Netanyahu here, by preferring the Prince Hamza to take over. I think this could have been a very dangerous move that would really shake the very foundations of the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom, and there is no there's no alternative to Jordan and the Hashemite kingdom rule, because if it's not there, stability is gone. And then there are two ways: either Jordan can become Somalia, or it can become a mini Iran or Syria. So diplomatically, I think it's very important for us to cooperate with Jordan and also help Jordan achieve its goals when they want to really spread their diplomatic fields to reassert themselves here in the region. And this is where the new government here is very, very important. Netanyahu was seen by King Abdullah almost as an enemy. However, it is important that Jordan also would tame its criticism against Israel, whether it's in the tribunal in Hague or at the UN, whether it's the Security Council or anything like that, that they always instigate condemnations of Israel because of maybe they want to placate their cells of Muslim brotherhoods. But it is important now, and I believe that pretty soon we will have a meeting between Bennett, the new Prime Minister of Israel, and the King of Jordan.
By the way, earlier this week, when Secretary of State Tony Blinken announced what was already known, but was up to now not officially declared, he announced the reopening of the American Consulate in East Jerusalem, in order for it to be a mission to, as he said, the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. And the goal, he said, eventually was to have a Jewish and democratic Israel and a Palestinian state. He didn't say democratic Palestinian state, because apparently the Americans have been weaned off the illusions which pervaded the Bush administration, especially with Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State, of having, as they said, full, free, and fair elections throughout the Middle East, which is what brought the Hamas to power in Gaza and in the Palestinian parliament. This goes also to the lack of full democracy in Jordan and in other places. The Americans have no illusions that if those countries, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and all the rest, go fully democratic, chaos will ensue. So they are not goading the Arabs now to be Americans, especially since Americans themselves are not so sure how democratic the political process has become in their own country.
On this, Jonathan, just 1 second here. What Israel tells Washington is that here in the Middle East, the choice is not between Jeffersonian democracy or dictatorship. It's between stability and radical Islam.
Indeed. The next country, of course, pivoting northward and looking to our northern sector, even though from a military standpoint, all we see is Iran. At this stage, I'd like to focus on Lebanon as a state. And unfortunately, you cannot make a distinction between the two to a broader degree. But in order to basically clean its hands with water or something else from the explosion in the Beirut port, which was devastating for not only the city of Beirut, but the country as a whole. The government, which then became a caretaker government, remains in office and remains the controller of this country that used to be, of course, Swiss d'Orient, the Switzerland of the Mediterranean, which unfortunately, other than its beauty, is far from so. Dr. Lerman, we see Hezbollah really destabilizing, using this caretaker government to destabilize the country. We see the budget that is scarce, even, well, pretty much non-existent, being poured into Shiite neighborhoods, being poured into all the sectors or sects from the current government, their families, their surroundings. And one clear picture for this is Tripoli. Tripoli is a Sunni, not connected to this caretaker government, and it's literally collapsing. People don't have food to eat. And from time to time, in Beirut, in Dahya, we see the big screen. We hear Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah come and speak about
in between one calf and another.
Forget about the Western bailout. Forget about reform. Let us help you. Let us bring Iranian oil. Let us bring Iranian food. They're already doing it for their shared neighborhoods. Why not for everyone? Is Lebanon going to fall into the Iranian web?
Well, first of all, you spoke about the state of Lebanon. There has been no state in Lebanon for some time. It's a state of mind at best. I mean, it is not a state. It does not function as a state. It is a geographical definition in which the military is much weaker than the dominant militia, which does not answer to the people of Lebanon. It is a foreign occupation force. Hassan Nasrallah goes around with two calling cards. One defines him as the leader of a political force in Lebanon, but the other is the representative of Ali Khamenei in Lebanon. And literally, this is his title. And as such, he is basically the agent of an occupying power. Now, most Lebanese understand this. They are simply powerless to resist. But there have been demonstrations, and they may erupt again. The question is, can the international community, given the leverage that they have over a collapsing economy, use this leverage wisely, effectively, to build an alternative political model for Lebanon? It's not impossible. I think that the French understand what is at stake. The Americans and the French are increasingly coordinated. There is a message out there that there can be and should be an alternative, even within the Shia, not everyone, among young people who see their brethren being sent not to fight the Zionist enemy, but to service the survival of a murderous, bloody, murderous dictatorship in Syria. And more Hezbollah young men died in these battles than all the years of fighting Israel from the 90s on. And add to this the fact that there's no longer a Daesh invasion that Hezbollah can protect. They made a lot. I mean, there was 12 segment series on Al-Manar about how they saved Lebanon from the second invasion, not the Zionist one, but the Daesh one. But this is also passé. This is over. So Hezbollah is basically just invested in sending Lebanese young men to die for Assad and to denude the country of the last vestiges of sovereignty. At some point, this is going to collapse on their heads. And Hassan Nasrallah is much more vulnerable than before. But it needs to be managed carefully. You don't want another May 2008 in which you have a direct confrontation which Hezbollah wins hands down.
Well, even though it didn't gain territorially speaking in 2008, and certain areas it was sent trucks and loads of body bags, basically. With that being said, those local militias that confronted them, or at least defended themselves against them, were backed by foreign forces, were granted the tools to do so. And this comes to the next question. Ambassador Ayalon, can Israel accept the collapse of all institutions in Lebanon in which Iran seizes control 100%, and then Israel has to contend with basically an extension of Iran in Lebanon, something that they're working on in Syria? The only factor there that is actually thwarting the Iranians from completely taking over are the Russians. And then we have Iraq, which we see Iraq slowly, even Prime Minister al-Kadhimi, who has been a champion of diminishing Iranian influence in the country, as well as in the popular mobilization forces, which are funded by the Iranians and trained by the Iranians. The Iranians basically are slowly taking over that corridor into the Mediterranean Sea and establishing a northern front that is fully Iranian, except for, again, pockets of Syria.
Yes, the Iranians, despite all the setbacks they have, politically, economically, with the sanctions, they are very diligent and very slowly but surely are trying to complete this, what King Abdallah called back 10 years ago, the Shiite crescent, where they're trying to take over from Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, through Lebanon, all the way to the Mediterranean and circle Israel. And by really occupying Lebanon fully, Israel will not be able to tolerate or to accept it, because what they are trying to do in Syria, they could do full-fledged in Lebanon, actually bringing all their bases all the way to the Green Line, to the Israeli border.
The blue line.
And the blue line.
Yeah.
And and Israel will have to take measures, because this would be unsustainable if Hezbollah, with its power, is a menace, is a real threat to the Israeli Western Galilee, Iranian forces, or Hezbollah bolstered by Iranian forces, would be untenable, to the extent that in such a case Israel may have to rethink about what used to be the security zone, meaning taking the territory in one way or another, maybe through local allies, all the way to the Bekaa, or even to the Ayalon. But I don't think that, we say, be careful of what you wish for, beware what you wish for. If indeed Nasrallah is wishing for the total collapse of this current Lebanese institutions and bring in the Iranians, I don't think that it's too heavy of a weight for even Iran to lift, given its own predicament economically. So in that case, it could really bring a total ruin to Lebanon. We already see the brain drain. Anyone who can, especially the youngers, who can leave Lebanon are fleeing Lebanon. So that would leave Lebanon with really such a scarcity of resources, human capital and real capital, and can really bring down the country on the head of Hezbollah and Nasrallah, who will be, of course, in direct blame for it. By the way, Nasrallah is also building on his personal relations with Raisi, president-elect of Iran, to also bring Iran, even if more into Lebanon than the Iranians themselves wish for.
Indeed. Mr. Owen, I'd like to hear your take on the Lebanese arena, but I would like also to bring Syria into the mix. 1 out of every Israeli strikes, and this is a quote from a statement one of the pilots who is actually active there, and it's public knowledge, 1 out of every 4 Israeli missions to thwart smuggling of precision-guided munitions or other types of munitions, of things that may challenge Israel's QME, or qualitative military edge, on its northern front vis-a-vis Hezbollah and the other Shiite organizations, is only executed. All other 3 are aborted or delayed for intelligence reevaluations, for various reasons, weather conditions, and whatnot. Does this indicate to us that whatever Israel is doing in order to thwart Iranian entrenchment on its northern front is only a delay, so to speak, to the inevitable conflagration?
First, on Lebanon, the situation there is disastrous. Once it turns catastrophic, we are going to have a mass movement of migrants and refugees and displaced persons on our northern border. This is not necessarily a security threat, but we are already seeing some signs of African migrants working in the restaurants of Beirut, losing their jobs and coming south because they have nothing to eat. And we may see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, a humanitarian problem. Israel will not be able to drive them away. So Israel has a stake at preventing Lebanon from collapsing. But as you said, Lebanon and Syria are not separable. And in Syria, yes, Israel has been successful in fighting the Iranian entrenchment intelligence-wise, militarily, but not the real Iranian entrenchment, which is similar to what has happened with Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah and Amal in Lebanon earlier on. And that is using their dawah, welfare, education, civic services. They are, first of all, doing this to the population. And they are working with a very, very long-range plan in mind. This is not military. Israel cannot fight this. They are changing the demographic basis of Syria. They are bringing in Afghans and Pakistanis and others. And when the civil war in Syria ends, it will be a different population, more hostile to Israel. And we have not mentioned up to now Russia. The Russian factor in Syria is the most important one. What you mentioned regarding the Israeli strikes being aborted is because of deconflicting with Russian pilots and other assets that Israel does not want. And when the United States is leaving and Russia is penetrating more and more, this is one power which Israel has to consider in addition to the American one.
Even though the Americans may be leaving, at least in a certain capacity, American hardware is remaining, at least with different pilots in
the trend. The trend is obvious, and it is a declared one. China is the most important threat in 2030 or 2040. Russia is a secondary one. The Middle East apparently is no longer the playground that America wants to play in.
Even though the Chinese, of course, draw a lot of its resources from this region, which brings a lot into question on...
But at least the Americans, if not the Israelis, think in a very logical, methodical way. You start out with a vision, and then you break it down into doctrine and force buildup. If you say that China is going to be the enemy, you build your forces to encounter it, and you cut the priority list from the bottom. And while the Middle East is important, it is less important than the Far East, the so-called Indo-Pacific, which is really Chinese, but the Americans called it the Indo-Pacific theater, and you can't have everything. So you must give up on lesser priorities, and we are the lesser priority now.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, of course, the JCPOA is being renegotiated indirectly, at least in Vienna, or at least right now. The various representatives have been sent back to their capitals in order to deliberate difficult questions, difficult decisions to be made. And a seventh round is not yet scheduled. Neither is a breakthrough in the talks between the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Iranian Organization for Nuclear or Energy Organization with regard to an interim arrangement in order to provide oversight of the Iranian program, meaning that except for intelligence organizations, which are quite deep in the veins of the Iranians, so to speak, the international community is oblivious to what is happening behind closed doors, as long as they don't have the key to enter that specific door. Now, my question to you is with regard to how this actually impacts the ground. We see the various Iranian proxies firing unmanned aerial vehicles, rockets, mortar shells repeatedly to U.S. bases, to installations belonging to the Central Intelligence Agency in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. And the Americans, of course, earlier this week responded quite forcefully. 2 targets, specific targets in Syria in Al-Mayadin, and 1 more target on the other side of the border in Iraq, near Al-Bukamal, but specifically destroying the 14th Brigade weapons caches there, which are of the Al-Shuhada and various components of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces. This, of course, indicated a signal not only for the fact that it was the anniversary of the makeup of the PMF, but it also provided a signal to the Iraqis that the Americans are not willing to sit still, as well as to the Iranians themselves. The Iranians, however, have instructed their militias to retaliate immediately, firing at the Al-Oma oil field in northwestern Syria, targeting an American base there. And, of course, there were several barrages of rockets. The clash ensued also between the SDF, which is the the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish forces, which are the ground forces basically for the American presence there. And on the other hand, we had the Afghan forces of Al-Fatimiyun and various Shiite organizations that are completely loyal to the Ayatollah regime in Tehran. How do you see this actually continue to destabilize the northern front? And is this going to expedite to a certain degree an American withdrawal? And this question goes to all of you, so feel free to interject and join in the conversation.
We have to bear in mind that the American administration has taken a decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. This is going to be a very dramatic and painful event because Afghanistan is more or less certain to fall into the hands of the Taliban with all the attending horrors that would ensue. So a complete rout of the American presence in our part of the world, I think, would actually be a very negative signal for the Biden administration. So they have now indicated to the Iranians that they are still here and they are not willing to take that kind of behavior sitting down. How will this affect the talks in Vienna is an interesting question because the Iranians may actually miscalculate and assume that the Biden administration would sign on to a new JCPOA, whatever the conditions the Iranians. And I think that would be a misreading of President Biden and the people around him. They are willing to go back to the JCPOA, but lay the foundations for further improvement down the road. I think they're serious about this stronger and longer business. This requires the United States to still have leverage on Iran. This is the conversation that Israel is now having with the United States. How do you sustain leverage on Iran down the road, even if the JCPOA is restored to some extent? Because otherwise, Biden will not be able to deliver even on his promise to President Rivlin, no Iranian nukes on my watch. Well, Uncle Joe, your watch is not that long.
Well, I'm sure Israel is willing to help if necessary.
Yes, but that is exactly why Israel must retain and does retain its capacity for independent action. So the situation, even if there is a breakthrough in Vienna, the situation will not become less dangerous.
As you've mentioned also multiple times on TV7's Middle East Review, a credible military threat is necessary.
An important part of an intelligent American strategy.
Ambassador Ayalon?
Well, you mentioned the term in the beginning of the show, miscalculation. And I think this is on the part of the Iranians now. And maybe this goes back to there is some merit in what Netanyahu, always says, that you cannot be conciliatory with aggressors, especially not with the Ayatollahs in Iran. So when Biden took over, when he was elected, some conciliatory measures, at least rhetorically, were taken. Also, the team that he picked to deal with Iran was the same team of Obama that reached the JCPOA. I think that brought the notion in Tehran that they can play the Americans almost as much as they want. So on the one hand, they're playing chicken in Geneva, playing very tough on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are trying to a war of attrition against the Americans in Syria and in Iraq. This may backfire, and we will soon know what are the results.
We don't have enough time to expand on the entire issue, but just in bullets, and at least this is one opinion, which of course not all of you may agree with. For the Iranians, nuclear weapons or the strive for a nuclear weapon, the quest for nuclear weapons is not an end in and of itself. It's a means for regime survival. If they could have a guarantee, not that they would have believed it because they are paranoid and conspiratorial, but if they could have a guarantee regarding the cessation of efforts for regime removal, they would have probably gone along with some arrangement for prolonging their quest for nuclear weapons. And because of that, paradoxically, the election of Raisi as Khamenei's protege and maybe even successor, maybe even heir apparent, the way Khamenei is trying to plan the succession, which of course we don't know. This could lead to some agreement with Biden regarding JCPOA 2.0. And one should add that the Israeli military officials who in 2015 looked at the emerging JCPOA were, of course, not ecstatic about it. They thought that they may have reached a better deal, but then again, the Iranians may not have agreed to such a good deal from the Israeli point of view. And they did not believe at the time that the Iranians will comply with it. They were astounded to see that the Iranians did comply with the letter and the spirit, and they would rather have a return to some sort of a deal which will enable the Israeli Defense Forces to plan for wars against Hezbollah and Hamas, rather than invest too much money in an Iranian scenario which may never come.
Well, indeed, Mr. Owen, I think it's safe to say, as we don't have very much time left, that as is similar in Lebanon, where Hezbollah has used Daesh or the Islamic State for promoting its legitimacy, the Islamic Republic of Iran here in this instant is using the nuclear weapon aspiration as a tool in order to keep alive its proactive revolutionary expansionism or its capacity to do so unhindered. And as I see all of you shaking your heads in acquiescence, this is where we have to stop now because we ran out of time. But I'd like to thank Ambassador Ayalon, Dr. Lerman, and Mr. Eran for being here. There will continue to be programs during the months of July. But please go to our website for the updated schedule. And then for myself and part of the team here in Jerusalem, we will see you next time on August 2nd. God bless and see you then. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.